You never think it'll happen to you. That you'll be the one with a story too bizarre to believe, the one warning others to stay away from certain roads or to trust their gut when something feels off. But here I am. It started as a fun weekend plan, a road trip with my closest friends to a secluded cabin in the mountains. Just us, the open road, and the promise of no cell service or responsibilities for a couple of days. We all needed the break. There were 4 of us: Ryan, me, Jessica, the planner of the group, Mark, our resident joker, and Claire, the cautious one. The trip began like any other, music blasting, snacks being passed around, and debates over who got to pick the next playlist. We were following GPS directions, taking Highway 49 before turning onto a smaller, less traveled road. That's where things started to get strange. The GPS began acting up. At first, it just took us on what seemed like unnecessary detours, nothing major. But then, the directions became nonsensical. It told us to turn left where there wasn't a road or suggested we continue straight, into the woods. We laughed it off. Mark even joked, "Guess this is how horror movies start, huh?" If only we'd known how right he was. When the GPS finally froze, we realized we were lost. The sun had already set, and the road around us was pitch black, lined with dense, towering trees. Claire suggested we pull over and check the map she'd packed, but it was useless, designed for highways, not winding back roads like these. "Let's just keep driving," Jessica said, trying to sound confident. "We'll hit a gas station eventually." We drove in silence for what felt like hours. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the road in a way that felt unnatural. I don't know how to describe it, but it seemed alive, like it was creeping closer, smothering us. Finally, we saw a light. A gas station loomed ahead, its neon sign flickering in the fog. It looked ancient, like it had been plucked from another era. "This place is straight out of a nightmare," Claire muttered. But we didn't have a choice. The gas gauge was nearly empty, and we were miles from anything else. Mark and I got out to pump gas while Jessica and Claire stayed in the car. The air was freezing, and the fog muffled every sound. I tried the pump, but it wasn't working. "I think we have to pay inside," I told Mark. The convenience store attached to the station was dimly lit and eerily quiet. When we walked in, the door's rusty bell jingled, but no one greeted us. The place was a mess, shelves half-stocked with dusty items, a flickering TV playing static in the corner. I rang the bell on the counter. For a moment, there was nothing. Then we heard footsteps. An old man shuffled out from the back room. He was thin and pale, his eyes sunken and glassy. His uniform was filthy, and he moved with an unsettling slowness. "Need gas?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The pump isn't working." The man stared at us for an uncomfortably long moment before turning to flip a switch on the wall. "Try now." As we turned to leave, he spoke again. "You shouldn't be out here." I froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his words sent a chill down my spine. "The fog. It brings things with it." Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Thanks for the warning," Mark said quickly, and we hurried back to the car. When we told Jessica and Claire what he'd said, they were just as freaked out as we were. "Let's just fill up and get out of here," Jessica urged. Mark pumped the gas while I kept glancing toward the store. The old man was standing in the window, watching us. His hollow eyes followed our every move, never blinking. When the tank was full, we peeled out of the lot, relieved to leave that place behind. But the road felt wrong. It didn't look the same as it had before. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the car's headlights. The GPS was still useless, and no matter how many turns we took, we seemed to be driving in circles. Then Jessica gasped. "There's someone out there." "What?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. I saw something, someone, on the side of the road. I slowed down, scanning the trees. Nothing. It's probably just your imagination, Mark said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. We kept driving, and that's when I saw it. A figure in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. The figure was tall and still, shrouded in the fog. It looked human, almost. Its proportions were off, its limbs too long, its posture unnaturally rigid. "What the hell is that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said. "I'm going around it." As I started to drive around, the figure moved. Its head snapped toward us with an unnatural speed, its empty eyes locking onto the car. "Go!" Mark shouted. I floored the gas, the tires screeching as we sped away. But as we drove, Claire screamed. "It's behind us." I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. The figure was following us, its jerky movements impossibly fast. No matter how fast I drove, it stayed with us, flickering in and out of the fog like a ghost. The road twisted, and I struggled to keep control of the car. Then, suddenly, we hit a sharp curve. The tires skidded, and we spun out, crashing to a stop at the edge of a ditch. The engine died. I turned the key, desperate to restart it, but it wouldn't budge. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The car was dead silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. No one dared to speak. We all heard it, footsteps crunching on the gravel, slowly closing the distance between us and whatever was out there in the fog. I twisted the key in the ignition again, harder this time. Nothing. Not even a sputter. Come on," I muttered through clenched teeth. Jessica grabbed my arm. "Ryan, stop. Just listen." The footsteps stopped. "Is it gone?" Mark whispered from the back seat. "No," Claire said, her voice barely above a breath. "It's waiting." The four of us sat frozen, staring into the dense fog that surrounded the car. The headlights barely pierced through it, but there was enough light to see the outline of something, someone, just beyond the reach of the beams. It wasn't moving. "Lock the doors," Jessica hissed. I hit the button, and the familiar click echoed through the car. I felt a small sense of relief, until the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It didn't walk. It shifted. One moment it was on the edge of the fog, and the next, it was closer. Just a little, but enough for us to see it more clearly. Its head was tilted, unnaturally so, as if it were studying us. The limbs were long and gangly, its joints bending in ways that didn't seem possible. Then it raised its hand. No, not a hand. A long, bony finger. It pointed directly at me. "Drive!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. "I can't." I yelled back. "You have to try." I turned the key again, praying the car would start. This time, the engine sputtered to life, and I didn't waste a second. I threw it into drive and floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the road. The fog was thicker now, so dense it felt like we were driving through a cloud. The road twisted and turned unpredictably, and I had to fight to keep the car from veering off the edge. But the figure wasn't gone. "It's still there!" Claire screamed, looking out the back window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. The same jerky, unnatural movements. The same long limbs. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was keeping up. "Faster, Ryan!" Jessica cried. "I'm going as fast as I can." I shouted back, the speedometer climbing. The road seemed endless, a winding, looping nightmare that refused to let us escape. The trees blurred into shadows, the fog swallowing everything but the thin stretch of pavement in front of us. And then, suddenly, the figure was gone. I glanced in the mirror again. Nothing. Just the fog, the darkness, and the faint glow of the taillights. "Do you think we lost it?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands still gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Mark was staring out the window, his face pale. "No. It's not gone." "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, panic rising in her voice. Mark turned to look at us, his eyes wide with terror. "It's ahead of us now." My stomach dropped. And then, the headlights caught it. The figure was standing in the middle of the road again, its body twisted into an unnatural pose, its head cocked at an impossible angle. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded, tires screeching, and we hit the figure. Or at least, we should have. The car passed right through it, as if it wasn't there at all. "What the?" I started, but before I could finish, the car died again. Everything went dark. The headlights, the dashboard, the interior lights, all gone. "Ryan," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I said, trying to keep calm. "No, Ryan," she said again, her voice shaking. "It's outside." Slowly, I turned to look out my window. And there it was. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was pressed against the glass. Its skin was pale and smooth, like porcelain, but cracked in places, revealing something dark and hollow underneath. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet I could feel them staring into me, piercing through every layer of my being. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then it smiled. The cracks on its face widened as its mouth stretched impossibly far, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of shattering glass, the screams of my friends, and the overwhelming feeling that we were being swallowed whole by the fog. When I came to, the car was in a ditch. The sun was rising, and the fog was gone. Jessica, Mark, and Claire were still there, unconscious but alive. We never spoke about what happened that night. Not to each other, not to anyone else. They say every road has its secrets. I didn't believe that, not until one summer night when a simple wrong turn led me to a place I'll never forget. It was supposed to be an easy drive. My girlfriend Emma and I had planned a weekend getaway, just the two of us. The cabin we rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. It was the kind of place you go to recharge, to get away from it all. The directions seemed simple enough. Highway 78, then onto County Road 12, followed by a gravel path that would take us straight to the cabin. We left late, though, so by the time we were on those back roads, it was already past midnight. The GPS worked fine at first. But as we turned onto County Road 12, it froze. I tapped the screen, trying to get it to reload. Nothing. "It's fine," I told Emma, keeping my voice light. "We'll just follow the road. It can't be that hard to find." The road was narrow, surrounded by dense trees that loomed over us like dark sentinels. Our high beams barely cut through the darkness. Emma kept glancing at the map, but it didn't seem to match what we were seeing outside. After a while, we came to a fork in the road. "Which way?" I asked. Emma squinted at the map. "It doesn't say there's a fork here." "Great." We debated for a minute before deciding to go left. It felt like the right choice at the time. It wasn't. The road got rougher, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires. The trees seemed to grow thicker, their branches clawing at the car like they wanted to pull us in. "This doesn't feel right," Emma said, her voice uneasy. I wanted to reassure her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then we saw the house. It appeared out of nowhere, sitting at the edge of a clearing. It was old, weathered wood, broken windows, and a sagging roof. There was no reason for it to be here, in the middle of nowhere. "We should turn around," Emma said immediately. I nodded, shifting into reverse. But before I could back up, the headlights caught something. Someone. A woman was standing in the middle of the road, just ahead of the house. She was barefoot, her long white dress torn and dirty. Her hair hung in messy, tangled strands, and she was facing away from us, staring into the trees. "Do you see her?" Emma whispered, clutching my arm. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "What is she doing?" "I don't know." I honked the horn lightly, just to get her attention. She didn't move. "Maybe she's in trouble," Emma said, though she sounded far from convinced. I didn't want to get out of the car, but leaving her there didn't feel right either. I rolled down the window a crack. "Hey! Are you okay?" No response. I honked again, louder this time. And that's when she turned. Her movements were slow, almost robotic. When she faced us, my stomach dropped. Her face was wrong. Pale, too pale, like all the blood had been drained from her. Her eyes were dark, hollow voids that seemed to suck the light from the air around her. And her smile. God, that smile. It stretched too wide, her lips splitting to reveal teeth that were sharp and jagged, like broken glass. She took a step toward the car. "Go," Emma said, her voice shaking. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas, but the tires spun uselessly in the loose gravel. The woman took another step. And another. I finally got traction, the car lurching backward. I spun the wheel, trying to turn us around, but as I did, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The headlights flickered, and for a moment, we were plunged into total darkness. When they came back on, she was gone. "Where is she?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep calm. Then we heard it. A tapping sound. It was coming from Emma's window. She turned slowly, and I'll never forget the scream that tore from her throat. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her dark eyes staring unblinking at Emma. Her hand, if you could call it that, was claw-like, scratching at the window, leaving streaks of something dark and oily behind. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw the car into gear and floored the gas, praying it would start. It did. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before catching, and we sped away, the house and the woman disappearing into the darkness behind us. We didn't stop until we hit the highway, where the GPS miraculously started working again. We never found the cabin. Never went back to that road. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping sound. I've always loved road trips. The open highway, the freedom, the adventure, it all felt like an escape. That was until one trip left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It started as a cross-country drive with my buddy Eric. We were heading west, taking the scenic route, stopping at quirky roadside attractions and cheap motels along the way. On the fourth night of the trip, we were somewhere in the middle of Nevada, driving through a stretch of desert that seemed to go on forever. The sun had long since set, and the two-lane highway was eerily empty. No other cars, no streetlights, just the dim glow of our headlights cutting through the darkness. "Man, we need to find a place to crash," Eric said, rubbing his eyes. I checked my phone for nearby motels, but there was no signal. "Great," I muttered. "Looks like we're on our own." We drove for another hour, the monotony of the road making us both restless. Just as I was about to suggest we pull over and sleep in the car, a flicker of neon appeared on the horizon. "There," Eric said, sitting up. As we got closer, we saw it was a small motel. The sign read, "Desert Haven," though half the letters were burned out, leaving it to read more like D_S_RTH_VEN. It's something, I said, pulling into the gravel parking lot. The place looked old. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a single light flickering above the office door. But at that point, we didn't care. Inside the office, a bell jingled as we walked in. The air smelled stale, like mildew and old carpet. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was greasy, his eyes sunken, and his smile felt wrong. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, glancing at Eric. "Just for the night," Eric added. The man nodded slowly and slid a key across the counter. "Room 6. Last one on the left." I paid in cash, and we grabbed the key, eager to get some rest. The room was as rundown as the rest of the place: dingy carpet, stained wallpaper, and a bed that creaked ominously when we sat on it. "This place is a dump," Eric said, flopping onto the bed. "Yeah, but it's better than sleeping in the car," I replied. We decided to turn in early, both of us too tired to care about the state of the room. That's when the knocking started. At first, it was faint, 3 soft taps at the door. I thought maybe it was Eric messing with me, but when I looked over, he was already half asleep. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" he mumbled, his eyes barely open. I shrugged it off and tried to sleep. Then it came again. Louder this time. Knock. 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 I sat up, my heart racing. "Eric, wake up." "What now?" he groaned. "Someone's at the door." Eric grumbled but got up to check. He peeked through the peephole and then turned back to me, his face pale. "There's no one there," he said. "What do you mean?" "You had to have heard that." "I did, but there's no one out there." We both stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the knocking didn't come again. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was nothing, maybe the wind or the building settling. But deep down, I didn't believe that. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth in front of our door. I shook Eric awake. "Listen." He froze, his eyes wide. "What the hell?" The footsteps stopped. Then came the knocking again. This time, it was different. The sound was harder, more insistent. Eric grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. "I'm not taking any chances." We sat there in silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The knocking stopped, and the footsteps faded. But then, the phone rang. The old rotary phone on the nightstand buzzed loudly, startling both of us. "Don't answer it," Eric whispered. But curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking. "Hello." At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice. It was faint, distorted, but I could make out the words. "Don't leave the room." The line went dead. I dropped the phone and turned to Eric. "We're leaving. Now." He didn't argue. We grabbed our bags and bolted for the door. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign still flickering. As we got to the car, I glanced back at the motel. Every window in every room had a face staring out at us. We didn't stop driving until the sun came up. When we finally pulled into a diner, we told the waitress about the motel. She looked at us like we were crazy. "There's no motel out there," she said. "Not for miles. I know what we saw. I know what happened. But I also know I'll never set foot on that stretch of road again." It was supposed to be just another stop on the road, a brief detour on the way to the mountains. I had planned this solo trip to clear my mind, to get away from the stress of life, work, and the unending noise of the city. Little did I know, I'd stumble upon something that would haunt me forever. I'd been driving for hours through rural Colorado, winding my way through endless hills and forests, when the gas gauge dipped below a quarter tank. The next major town was still a good 2 hours away, and I wasn't about to risk running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. That's when I saw the sign. Welcome to Barrows Hollow. Population, 98. The lettering was faded, the wood weathered and splintered, but it was enough to catch my attention. A mile later, I spotted an arrow pointing to a gas station. It was off the main road, down a narrower path that cut through dense trees. Something about it felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Small towns always have that eerie vibe, right? The road opened up into what looked like an old-fashioned main street, straight out of a 1950s postcard. Quaint little buildings lined the street, a diner, a general store, a barber shop. At the far end, I saw the gas station, a single pump standing under a rusted canopy. I pulled up, got out, and immediately noticed the silence. No cars. No people. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The pump looked ancient, the kind you'd see in a museum, and it didn't have a credit card slot. Great. I'd have to go inside to pay. The gas station's door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint smell of oil and old wood. Behind the counter sat an older man, his face lined and weathered like the buildings outside. "Fill it up," he asked without looking at me. His voice was raspy, almost mechanical. "Yeah," I said. "Do you take cards?" He finally looked up, his eyes strangely dull. "Cash only." I hesitated. "I think I've got some cash in the car. Be right back." As I turned to leave, he said, "Don't stay too long." I stopped. "What do you mean?" But he didn't answer. He just stared at me, unblinking, until I stepped outside. Back at the pump, I noticed something strange. The street I had driven down was gone. In its place was more forest, thick and impenetrable. I spun around, my heart racing. The town was still there, but everything else, the road, the highway, the hills beyond, was swallowed by trees. This didn't make sense. I'd just driven in. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. I filled up the tank quickly, paid the old man in cash, and got back in the car. As I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed movement in one of the windows of the diner. A face. It was a woman, her hair in a 1950s style updo, staring out at me. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched as I drove past. I tried to find my way back to the main road, but the street seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't match what I remembered. Every corner I turned brought me back to the same spot, the town square. The diner. The general store. The barber shop. And the people. They were coming out now, one by one. Men in overalls, women in vintage dresses, children clutching stuffed animals. They didn't speak. They didn't move quickly. They just stood there, staring at me. I hit the gas, speeding down a side street, desperate to find an exit. The road narrowed, the trees closing in again, but I kept going. Then I saw it. A house at the end of the street, its windows glowing faintly. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I thought someone inside could help me. Or maybe I just didn't want to be alone anymore. The door was unlocked, and the air inside was colder than it should have been. The house smelled of dust and decay, as if no one had lived there for decades. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I moved through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing on the creaky floorboards. Each room was empty, but the furniture was arranged as if someone had just stepped out, a coffee cup on the table, a newspaper folded neatly on a chair. Then I found the photos. Black and white images lined the walls, all of them of the same people, the man from the gas station, the woman in the diner, the children I'd seen in the square. Except in the photos, they were younger. Much younger. My stomach turned as I realized some of the pictures dated back to the 1920s. What the hell is this place? I whispered. That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, crossing the ceiling above me. Hello. I called again, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Then they started again, moving toward the staircase. I bolted. As I ran out of the house, I saw the townsfolk again. They were standing at the edge of the street, forming a line, blocking my path. Their faces were pale, expressionless. Their eyes empty. I turned and ran the other way, back to my car. When I reached the gas station, it was gone. The building, the pump, the old man, everything had vanished. In its place was more forest. I don't know how long I wandered through those woods, but eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. A passing truck driver found me hours later, disoriented and shaken. When I told him about Barrows Hollow, he frowned. There's no town out there, he said. Hasn't been for nearly 100 years. It burned down in the 1930s. Nobody survived. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him about the gas station, or the people, or the photos. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps upstairs. The stretch of highway between Arizona and New Mexico is nothing but desolation. Miles of barren desert, broken only by the occasional tumbleweed or a rusted-out car abandoned years ago. It's the kind of road that swallows you whole if you're not careful. I was on this road late one summer night, heading east to visit my sister. My plan had been to reach Albuquerque by evening, but delays left me driving long after the sun had set. The highway was eerily empty, just me, the stars, and the faint hum of my car engine. That's when I saw the sign. Rest stop, 2 miles. Relieved, I decided to pull over. I wasn't sleepy yet, but I needed a break. Stretch my legs. Clear my head. The rest stop came into view sooner than I expected, a faintly lit building sitting in the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was empty, save for a single old sedan parked crookedly near the entrance. Its windows were dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I parked a few spots away, leaving the engine running for a moment as I debated whether this was a good idea. The rest stop looked functional, barely. The overhead lights flickered, casting shadows that danced unnervingly across the cracked pavement. Still, I figured a quick stop wouldn't hurt. The air was stifling as I stepped out, heavy with the scent of dry earth and something faintly metallic. The rest stop building loomed ahead, its facade peeling and weathered. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the small, empty space. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, harsh glow over the dingy interior. There was a row of vending machines against one wall, their displays blinking erratically. To the left, a door marked "Restrooms" hung slightly ajar. But what caught my attention was the bulletin board near the entrance. It was cluttered with faded flyers and missing person posters, some of them so old the ink had almost completely faded. One of the posters stood out. It was a photo of a young man, maybe in his early 20s, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The name below read Daniel Walsh. The date of disappearance was over 15 years ago. As I stared at it, I felt a chill run down my spine. Shaking off the unease, I decided to use the restroom and get back on the road as quickly as possible. The hallway leading to the restrooms was dim, the light bulb above flickering like it might go out at any second. The men's room door creaked open with a push, revealing a space that was somehow worse than I'd expected. Cracked tiles, graffiti on the walls, and a single flickering light that barely illuminated the room. I was the only one there, at least, that's what I thought. As I stood at the sink, washing my hands, I caught a flicker of movement in the mirror. Behind me, one of the stall doors was slowly swinging open. I froze, my heart pounding. Hello. I called, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I turned slowly, expecting to see, well, I wasn't sure what I expected. But the stall was empty, the door creaking gently as it swayed. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. I dried my hands quickly and headed back to the main area. As I stepped out of the restroom, I stopped in my tracks. The old sedan I'd seen earlier was gone. That wasn't what unnerved me, though. What sent my stomach dropping was the fact that there were now footprints leading from where the car had been, stopping just outside the building's entrance. And they weren't mine. I stared at the footprints for a long moment, my mind racing. They were fresh, outlined clearly in the dust. But whoever had made them was nowhere to be seen. I glanced around the parking lot, suddenly hyper-aware of the stillness. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and silent. I decided it was time to leave. As I got back into my car, I noticed something strange. The gas gauge, which had been just below half when I stopped, was now dangerously close to empty. What the hell? I muttered, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. Panic bubbled up as I tried again. And again. Nothing. I checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward. And then another. As he moved closer, I realized something was wrong. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, like a puppet on strings. My blood ran cold as I noticed his face. It was the man from the missing person poster. Daniel Walsh. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away as Daniel Walsh, or whatever he had become, continued his slow, unnatural approach. He stopped a few feet from the car, his head tilted at an odd angle, as if he were studying me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to get away, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. Suddenly, Daniel raised his arm and pointed back toward the rest stop. His finger was trembling, but his intent was clear. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. No. No way. He didn't lower his arm. Instead, his mouth moved again, forming silent words that I couldn't understand. Then, from inside the building, I heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping. The sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing across the empty parking lot. It was coming from the hallway I had just walked through, the one leading to the restroom. I whipped my head back toward Daniel, but he was gone. The parking lot was empty again. I didn't even see where he could have gone. There was no cover, no trees, just flat, open desert stretching endlessly in all directions. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I had no choice. My car wasn't starting, my phone was useless, and there was no one else around. If there was something, or someone, back in the rest stop that could help me, I had to take the risk. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, stepped out of the car, and made my way back inside. The building felt different this time. Colder. Darker. The buzzing fluorescent lights were now completely silent, their glow dim and unnatural. The tapping and dragging sounds were louder, echoing from deeper within the building. They weren't coming from the restroom anymore. They were coming from behind a door marked "Maintenance." I hesitated, every nerve in my body telling me to turn around and leave. But something compelled me to keep going. I pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was small and cluttered, filled with tools, cleaning supplies, and broken furniture. But that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, slightly ajar. The tapping and dragging sounds were coming from below. I shone my flashlight on the trapdoor, the beam trembling in my shaking hands. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the trapdoor slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, tripping over a mop handle and nearly dropping my flashlight. Something moved behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Daniel again, or worse. But the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I bolted out of the maintenance room, my footsteps echoing loudly as I raced back to the main area. That's when I saw them. The missing people. They were standing in the hallway, their expressions blank, their bodies still. Daniel was among them, along with dozens of others. Some of them looked like they'd been there for decades, their clothes outdated and tattered. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the door, I glanced back at the bulletin board. The missing posters had changed. Every face on the board was now looking directly at me, their eyes following me as I moved. One of the posters at the very bottom caught my attention. It was a photo of me. The name below it read, "Unknown Traveler." The date of disappearance was today. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I ran back to my car, praying it would start. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. I didn't look back as I tore out of the parking lot, the tires kicking up dust as I sped back onto the highway. I don't know how far I drove before I finally pulled over to catch my breath. The rest stop was gone, swallowed by the desert as if it had never existed. When I told my sister about what happened, she didn't believe me. She said I must have fallen asleep at the wheel, hallucinated the whole thing. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping sound. And I still have the flashlight I used that night. The batteries died years ago. But every now and then, it turns on by itself.